In the depths of a brutal winter, the world watched in stunned silence as one of history's most lopsided conflicts unfolded. On November 30, 1939, the Soviet Union, possessing one of the world's largest military forces with over 1 million soldiers, 2,318 aircraft, and thousands of tanks, launched a full-scale invasion of tiny Finland, a nation of just 3.7 million people with an army of barely 300,000 men. What happened next defied every military prediction. Instead of a swift 3-week victory that Stalin anticipated, the Soviet juggernaut found itself mired in a 3.5-month nightmare. The Finns, despite being outnumbered 3-1 in manpower, 20-1 in aircraft, and facing an enemy with overwhelming tank superiority, would inflict such devastating casualties that Soviet leaders would later admit they had underestimated Finnish resistance by a factor of 10. This is the story of how a small Nordic nation, armed with little more than determination, ingenuity, and an indomitable spirit called Sisu, transformed an impossible situation into one of the most remarkable military stands in human history. It's the tale of how Finland didn't just survive the Soviet onslaught, it humiliated a superpower, the spirit that defied an empire, understanding Sisu. To understand how Finland achieved the impossible, we must first understand the concept that powered their resistance. Sisu is a uniquely Finnish word that defies simple translation. It encompasses stoic determination, hardihood, grit, bravery, willpower, tenacity, guts, and resilience, all compressed into a single powerful concept that forms the very heart of Finnish national identity. Sisu is not merely courage or persistence, it's an action-oriented mindset that manifests when adversity pushes you to give up, yet your white-knuckled determination allows you to hold on. It's what drives a person to take on challenges that seem above their mental and physical capacities, to grapple with endeavors that appear crazy or hopeless. During the Winter War, Sisu transformed from a cultural concept into a tangible force that would enable Finnish soldiers to charge tanks with crowbars, to ski through blizzards to attack armored columns, and to resist an empire that seemed bent on their annihilation. When the Soviet Union demanded territorial concessions from Finland in October 1939, Finnish leaders knew they faced an impossible choice: surrender their sovereignty piecemeal through diplomatic pressure, or fight a war they couldn't possibly win. They chose to fight, not because victory seemed likely, but because Sisu demanded they stand their ground. This decision would transform the frozen forests of Karelia into a graveyard for Soviet ambitions and a testament to human resilience. The art of asymmetric warfare, Finnish tactical innovations. The Finnish military understood from the outset that conventional warfare would lead to certain defeat. Instead, they embraced asymmetric tactics that leveraged their advantages while exploiting Soviet weaknesses. These innovations weren't merely clever military maneuvers, they were acts of desperation, transformed into brilliance, born from necessity and powered by Sisu. The ghosts of the forest, ski troops and winter warfare. Finland's most revolutionary advantage lay in transforming winter itself into a weapon, unlike the Soviet forces who struggled through snow in standard military vehicles and marched in khaki uniforms that stood out like beacons against the white landscape. Finnish troops moved like ghosts through their native terrain. Virtually every Finnish soldier was an expert skier, able to traverse 50-60 kilometers per day through deep snow while carrying full combat gear. Ski patrols could approach silently through dense forests, launch surprise attacks on Soviet columns confined to narrow roads, then vanish back into the wilderness before effective countermeasures could be organized. These mobile units operated in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees C, using the extreme cold as both camouflage and weapon. They wore white snow capes, often improvised from bed linens, that made them nearly invisible against the snow, while Soviet soldiers in dark uniforms presented perfect targets against the white backdrop. The effectiveness of ski warfare was demonstrated repeatedly throughout the conflict. Finnish ski patrols could circle entire Soviet divisions, cutting supply lines and communication cables, then systematically destroy isolated pockets of resistance. One Finnish ski battalion, operating behind enemy lines for weeks, destroyed over 200 Soviet vehicles and killed more than 1,000 enemy soldiers, while suffering fewer than 50 casualties themselves. The Motti tactic, chopping wood Soviet style. Perhaps the most devastating Finnish innovation was the Motti tactic, a term derived from the Finnish word for a measure of chopped firewood. The concept was elegantly simple yet brutally effective. Instead of facing Soviet forces head-on, Finnish units would allow enemy columns to penetrate deep into Finnish territory along narrow forest roads. Then, like lumberjacks sectioning logs, they would cut these long columns into isolated segments. Using felled trees, explosives, and well-positioned machine gun nests, Finnish forces would block roads at multiple points simultaneously, trapping Soviet units in segments typically 3–5 kilometers long. These isolated pockets, called mottis, would then be subjected to continuous harassment, sniper fire, artillery bombardment, and probing attacks designed to prevent sleep, destroy morale, and gradually whittle away at enemy strength. The Motti tactic exploited fundamental weaknesses in Soviet military organization. Soviet doctrine emphasized massive columns moving in close formation, with limited ability to operate independently once cut off from headquarters. When trapped in mottis, Soviet units found themselves without food, ammunition, medical supplies, or communication with command structures. Finnish forces, operating on home terrain with superior mobility, could systematically destroy these isolated segments one by one while maintaining pressure on adjacent pockets. The Battle of Suomussalmi became the textbook example of Motti tactics in action. Over 4 weeks, Finnish forces methodically destroyed an entire Soviet division of 27,000 men, killing or capturing more than 23,000 while suffering only 750 casualties themselves. The road leading to Suomussalmi became known as the Road of Death, littered with burned-out vehicles, abandoned equipment, and the frozen bodies of Soviet soldiers who had been reduced to eating tree bark and leather to survive. The birth of a legend, the Molotov cocktail. When Soviet tanks began rolling across the Finnish border, Finnish forces faced a critical problem. They possessed virtually no anti-tank weapons. The few artillery pieces they had were outdated and insufficient to stop the Soviet armored advance. In desperation, they turned to an improvised weapon that would become legendary, the Molotov cocktail. The weapon's invention stemmed from equal parts necessity and dark humor. When Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov claimed that Soviet bombing raids over Finland were actually airborne humanitarian food deliveries, the Finns sarcastically began calling Soviet cluster bombs Molotov bread baskets. When they developed their improvised anti-tank weapon, they named it the Molotov cocktail, a drink to go with Molotov's food parcels. The weapon itself was deceptively simple. A glass bottle filled with a mixture of gasoline, kerosene, and tar, often with added potassium chlorate for improved ignition. A simple wick, sometimes just a cloth strip soaked in alcohol, provided the ignition source. The genius lay not in the weapon's construction, but in its tactical application and continuous refinement. Molotov cocktail production statistics. By the war's end, Finnish production facilities had manufactured over 542,000 Molotov cocktails, with 87 women and 5 men working brutal hours at the Alko Corporation's Rajamäki distillery to meet demand. Remarkably, this massive production effort occurred without a single dangerous mishap or injury, a testament to both Finnish efficiency and the careful engineering that went into each bottle. The effectiveness of Molotov cocktails against Soviet armor was enhanced through systematic tactical refinement. Finnish soldiers discovered that leaving bottles 1/3 empty increased the likelihood of breakage upon impact. They developed windproof ignition systems using chemical ampoules that would ignite automatically when the bottle shattered. Most importantly, they developed a doctrine that deliberately allowed Soviet tanks to penetrate deep into Finnish positions before attacking them from concealed positions. The psychological impact was devastating. Soviet tank crews, who had expected to roll over primitive Finnish resistance, found themselves under constant threat of attack from soldiers who would emerge from the forest, smash bottles against their engine compartments, and disappear before effective response could be mounted. The sticky gasoline mixture would seep into engine compartments and vision slits, creating fires that could disable even heavily armored vehicles. Tank crews found themselves fighting two enemies simultaneously: the physical threat of incineration and the psychological terror of invisible attackers who could appear at any moment from the frozen forest. The frozen battles that shocked the world. The Battle of Rat Road, a Soviet nightmare. Among the most dramatic examples of Finnish effectiveness was the Battle of Rat Road in January 1940. A Soviet division of 25,000 men began advancing along a narrow forest road toward the Finnish town of Suomussalmi. Expecting minimal resistance, the Soviets marched in standard formation, columns of soldiers marching in lockstep, vehicles bumper to bumper along the single available road. Finnish forces under Colonel H. Jalmar Siilasvuo watched from the frozen forest as the Soviet column stretched over 20 kilometers into the wilderness. Then they struck with brutal precision. Ski patrols severed the column at multiple points, creating isolated pockets that became death traps. For 12 days, Finnish forces conducted what became known as the Finnish Turkey Shoot. Battle of Rat Road results. Soviet casualties: 23,000 killed or captured. Finnish casualties: 750 men. Kill ratio more than 30:1. Soviet vehicles destroyed: 300 plus. Equipment captured: enough to supply Finnish forces for months. The White Death. Simo Heihe. Simo Heihe, known as the White Death, exemplified Finnish marksmanship and the psychological warfare that made Soviet soldiers dread Finnish forests. Operating alone in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees C, Heihe killed 505 Soviet soldiers in less than 100 days, using nothing more than an unscoped rifle, iron sights, and superhuman patience. Dressed in white camouflage that made him nearly invisible against the snow, he would lie motionless for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the perfect shot. Soviet forces dispatched entire counter-sniper teams specifically to eliminate him, all of whom failed. Heihe survived the war, but not before taking a bullet to the jaw that removed half his face. Yet even this wound didn't stop him from continuing to fight until the war's final days. In January 1940 alone, Finnish fighters shot down 34 Soviet aircraft while losing none of their own. These pilots operated in brutal conditions that would have grounded most air forces, demonstrating both technical skill and the same Sisu spirit that characterized the ground campaign. The mathematics of defeat, Soviet catastrophic losses. The true measure of Finnish tactical effectiveness lies not in individual heroics or clever innovations, but in the catastrophic losses they inflicted on Soviet forces. The numbers tell a story of such devastating proportions that Soviet authorities would spend decades trying to minimize or hide the true extent of their humiliation. Soviet casualty estimates vary depending on source and methodology, but even the most conservative figures reveal the scope of the disaster. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov initially reported 745 soldiers killed and 863 wounded, a figure that was quickly recognized as grossly understated. Later Soviet archival research, conducted by military historian Grigory Krivoshev, documented 875 irretrievable losses, soldiers killed, missing or who died from wounds, and 264,904 sanitary losses, including those wounded, frostbitten, or evacuated due to disease. This brought total Soviet combat losses to 333,413 men. The most comprehensive study, conducted by Russian military historians in the Kilin Project, 2006-2009, documented even higher figures: 138,551 irretrievable losses, 135 prisoners who died in Finnish custody, and 206,538 sanitary losses, a total of 345,089 casualties. These losses occurred over just 105 days of combat, averaging 3,300 Soviet casualties per day. The disparity becomes even more striking when compared to Finnish losses. Finland suffered approximately 25,904 soldiers killed or missing, 43,557 wounded, and 800 captured, total casualties of about 70,000. This meant that for every Finnish soldier lost, the Soviet Union lost nearly 5. On a daily basis, Finnish forces were losing 678 men per day, compared to Soviet losses exceeding 3,300 per day, a ratio of nearly 5. 1. Why were Soviet losses so catastrophic? The reasons for these catastrophic Soviet losses reveal the effectiveness of Finnish tactical innovations and the failure of Soviet military planning, poor leadership and training. Stalin's purges of military leadership between 1936–1938 had eliminated the Soviet Union's most experienced commanders, leaving inexperienced officers to face Finnish tactics they neither understood nor could counter effectively. Rigid organizational structure. The Red Army's rigid command structure proved ill-suited to the fluid, decentralized warfare that characterized the Winter War. Soviet doctrine emphasized massive columns moving in close formation, with limited ability to operate independently. Inadequate winter equipment. Soviet soldiers arrived in Finland wearing khaki summer uniforms, ill-suited for temperatures that regularly dropped below °C. Frostbite claimed more Soviet casualties than Finnish bullets, with some units losing up to 40% of their strength to cold-related injuries before they even encountered Finnish forces. Vehicle and equipment failures. Soviet vehicles, designed for warmer climates, suffered from frozen engines, cracked radiators and brittle metal components that snapped in the extreme cold. Ineffective intelligence. Soviet commanders consistently underestimated Finnish capabilities and overestimated their own advantages. They failed to account for Finnish knowledge of terrain, mobility advantages, or the psychological impact of operating in hostile territory. Supply line vulnerabilities. Finnish ski patrols could systematically cut Soviet supply lines, leaving frontline units without food, ammunition, or medical supplies for extended periods. The psychological impact of these losses cannot be overstated. Soviet commanders found themselves unable to explain to Stalin why divisions of 15,000 men would return with fewer than 3,000 survivors. The Winter War became a strategic disaster that would influence Soviet military thinking for decades, convincing Hitler that the Red Army was a paper tiger that could be easily defeated, a miscalculation that would cost Germany dearly 4 years later. The legacy that shocked the world, lasting impact and global consequences. When the guns fell silent on March 13, 1940, the world stood in collective astonishment. Finland had not won the war. They had been forced to cede 11% of their territory to the Soviet Union under the Moscow Peace Treaty. Yet in the most important ways, Finland had achieved a victory that would resonate through history. They had preserved their independence, their sovereignty, and most crucially their national identity. Global military impact. The Winter War's impact extended far beyond the frozen forests of Karelia. It fundamentally altered the global perception of both Finland and the Soviet Union. The Red Army, which had been viewed as an unstoppable juggernaut, was revealed to be a lumbering giant with feet of clay. Stalin's purges of military leadership between 1936–1938 had eliminated the Soviet Union's most experienced commanders, leaving inexperienced officers to face Finnish tactics they neither understood nor could counter effectively. The Winter War exposed these fundamental weaknesses to the world. Most significantly, the Winter War directly influenced Hitler's decision to launch Operation Barbarossa in 1941. German military intelligence, observing Soviet performance against Finland, concluded that the Red Army was militarily incompetent and could be defeated in a matter of weeks. This miscalculation, based largely on the Winter War's misleading evidence, would cost Germany dearly. The Soviet Union, chastened by its Finnish experience, had begun desperately needed military reforms. By 1941, when German forces invaded, they faced a very different Red Army than the one that had struggled so badly in Finland. Finnish national identity. For Finland, the Winter War cemented sisu as more than a cultural concept. It became the foundation of national identity. The war demonstrated that a small nation could stand against overwhelming odds when united by determination, innovative thinking, and unwavering commitment to survival. Finnish military tactics developed during the Winter War influenced guerrilla warfare worldwide, with ski patrol tactics being studied by special forces units, and the Molotov cocktail becoming a symbol of resistance movements everywhere. The human cost of the Winter War was severe for both sides. Finland lost approximately 70,000 casualties from a population of just 37 million, roughly 19% of the entire population. The Soviet Union, despite victory, suffered losses that would haunt them for decades. The Kill-In Project's estimate of 345,089 total casualties represented not just military defeat, but a blow to Soviet prestige that would influence Cold War politics for generations. Lessons for modern warfare. Perhaps most importantly, the Winter War demonstrated that technological and numerical superiority could be overcome by superior tactics, intimate knowledge of terrain, and unbreakable morale. It became a case study in asymmetric warfare, showing how a smaller force could achieve disproportionate effectiveness against a larger opponent. Military academies worldwide still study Winter War tactics as examples of how to maximize limited resources while minimizing vulnerabilities. Key tactical lessons that endure: environment as force multiplier. The Finnish use of winter conditions, terrain, and local knowledge demonstrated how environmental factors could offset numerical disadvantages. Mobility over mass. Finnish ski troops proved that speed and agility could overcome superior numbers and firepower. Psychological warfare. The invisible threat of snipers, the terror of Molotov cocktail attacks, and the isolation of Motti tactics destroyed Soviet morale as effectively as bullets. Improvisation and innovation. The rapid development and mass production of Molotov cocktails showed how necessity drives innovation even in desperate circumstances. Decentralized command. Finnish forces operated effectively with minimal top-down control, allowing rapid adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. Morale and national unity. Sisu demonstrated that collective determination and national unity could sustain resistance even when military logic suggested surrender. Cultural and political legacy. The legacy of Sisu that emerged from the Winter War continues to define Finland today. The concept transformed from a cultural characteristic into a national ethos that influences everything from education to business to international relations. Modern Finland's reputation for innovation, resilience, and quality, whether in technology, education, or social policy, can trace its roots to the demonstration of Sisu during those brutal winter months of 1939-1940. The Winter War also left an indelible mark on the concept of modern warfare itself. It demonstrated that future conflicts would not be decided solely by superior numbers or technology, but by adaptability, innovation, and the ability to leverage local advantages. The Finnish success with improvised weapons, mobile tactics, and psychological warfare influenced the development of special forces units worldwide, and contributed to the evolution of modern guerrilla warfare doctrine. In the end, the Winter War stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of how determination, innovation, and national unity can overcome seemingly impossible odds. It proved that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning, but from refusing to lose. Finland's stand against the Soviet Union became a testament to the power of human resilience, a frozen David's defiance of a nuclear-powered Goliath that continues to inspire those who face overwhelming challenges. The winter of 1939-1940 did more than freeze lakes and chill bones. It froze an image of Finnish courage into the world's collective memory. In the frozen forests of Karelia, a small nation discovered that Sisu wasn't just about surviving impossible odds. It was about redefining what victory means when survival itself becomes the ultimate triumph. The Winter War proved that the greatest weapon in any military arsenal is not technology, firepower, or numbers. It's the unbreakable will of a people who refuse to surrender their identity, their freedom, or their future. Finland's Sisu transformed what should have been a 3-week defeat into a 3-month demonstration that even superpowers can be humbled when they face an opponent who simply will not quit. For 3 months and 13 days, Finland held the line, not because they were stronger, not because they had better weapons, not because victory was possible, but because Sisu demanded nothing less. And in doing so, they wrote one of history's most inspiring chapters about what human beings can achieve when they refuse to accept the impossible. The Soviet Union won territory, but Finland won immortality. They won the right to remain Finnish. They won the respect of the world. And they won a place in history as the nation that proved David could bloody Goliath's nose so badly that the giant would never forget.